Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging market stocks slid lower today as fears of slowing global growth left investors queuing up to exit developing world markets and move into safer assets. Now, South Africa's JSE reflected that downbeat risk appetite as we saw a stronger dollar and renewed fears about the economic fallout from the US-China trade war weighing on the bourse today. Now, industrials were the big losers, while we did see gold miners seeing some gains today. In Kenya, the bourse remains in positive territory despite last week's terrorist attack, with National Bank of Kenya topping the gainers list today. Now, also coming up on the show, the World Economic Forum kicks off in Davos with several leaders pulling out. The government shutdown negatively affects trade of farm produce in the US. And an Egyptian factory offers an alternative to boost dwindling cotton production in the country. Now, the 49th Annual World Economic Forum has officially kicked off in the alpine town of Davos in Switzerland. The focus of the forum is on globalization in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. Political leaders taking part this year include Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. US President Donald Trump, as well as UK Prime Minister Theresa May, are skipping this year's meeting due to a government shutdown as well as a Brexit deadlock. Now, the annual event is also a key place for bilateral meetings between heads of state, business leaders and other dignitaries who've plenty to discuss behind closed doors.
The globalization 4.0 has to be more human-centered, because we are now, in some way, in a battle between robots and humankind. We don't want to become the slaves of the new technologies. So globalization has to aim at being human-centered.
Now, of course, the Davos summit comes as the International Monetary Fund has revised down its global growth forecast for the coming year. Well, CGTN's Guy Henderson tells us more from Davos.
There's no global recession round the corner, says the IMF, but economic growth is set to slow and governments need to get their act together.
And the message is the following for policymakers: address remaining vulnerabilities and be ready if a serious slowdown were to materialize.
The warning came in Davos, Switzerland, where business and political leaders are gathering for the World Economic Forum.
When they gathered here 12 months ago, there was a sense of relief, some optimism that the global economy finally seemed to be getting back on its feet. The mood has changed here now. And even the IMF admits that in this unpredictable global environment, their forecast may yet be thrown off again.
US President Donald Trump may have a hand in that. He cancelled his trip to Davos to focus on the government shutdown back home. If that drags on, the world's largest economy is bound to feel the effect. Another deal that's yet to be brokered, one to end Washington's trade war with China, whose government reported on Monday its slowest annual growth rate since 1990. And then there's that great unknown, Brexit. A disorderly withdrawal could provide another unwelcome economic shock. Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May stayed home too. For several Western leaders, in fact, this gathering of the global elite is not the place to be seen right now. Critics are vocal.
The people in Davos, the big company leaders and the political leaders, are part of the problem. They are the problem, and we want them to be the solution to ending extreme inequality, because it's out of control, it's widening, it's hurting our economy, slowing our economies, it's undermining democracy, it is trapping people in poverty. So I'm here to call for action.
Growing inequality will be part of the discussion here in the coming days too, even with more haves in the room than have-nots. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Davos.
Well, let's discuss this year's event further with Guy. He now joins us in Davos. Great to have you on the show, Guy. Now, this year's event does come at a time when we are seeing an increasingly fragmented political landscape globally. There are also a number of notable no-shows at WEF this year. Give us a sense of what the mood is like this year and certainly the burning issues that are on the table.
Well, it's funny, colleagues who've been here many times over the years are telling me that perhaps there is a slightly more laid-back and sort of calm feel here than certainly last year. Perhaps part of that is because, as you said, the US delegation has cancelled its trip, and so there's not that sort of dramatic presidential motorcade moving through the snow, blocking all the traffic, that kind of thing. Behind the scenes, though, there is a good deal here to worry about, perhaps compared to 12 months ago. When leaders came here then, there was a sense of optimism, some relief. I think that the global economy seems to be getting back on its feet, and there were some quite strong indications of economic growth, and yet here we are now with signs of an economic slowdown coming, and a worry, I think, that many governments across the world are not particularly well prepared to handle and mitigate the effects of that economic slowdown. So on the short term, that's a big worry here and a discussion point. And as the long-term issues, the big theme of this year's World Economic Forum is globalization 4.0, this idea that there are a number of interconnected technologies that are basically moving the world to sort of change and progress at an unprecedented pace. And that is a sort of long-term issue, a very big point of discussion here, again, about whether policymakers and human beings are able to keep up with the rate of technological change.
Now, Guy, as you mentioned, on Monday we did see the IMF announce that it will be trimming its global growth forecast. We also saw a survey of business leaders globally released, and that showed increasing pessimism on their part as, of course, trade tensions loom. Now, what are some of the significant events to come out of today in light of all this?
Well, this is another big worry at the moment. And a big worry reported in the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, which comes out a few days before the actual summit starts. A trade war, a risk of an escalating trade war, and the impact that could have on already sluggish economic growth. We actually heard from an executive from the Chinese company Huawei during the course of today, in quite an outspoken way, urging business leaders here specifically to speak up. To speak out against the impact and the damaging of impact in his view of that escalating trade war, and he sort of framed it as being a ticking time bomb, that unless this trade war is brought to an end, it may sort of spiral and spread to all sorts of different sectors and end up costing not just China and the United States but many other countries a great deal as well. We have also heard, not in direct response to those comments from the Huawei executive, from US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's not here in person, but he linked up via video link to take part in a session this afternoon. And on the one hand, he said that the US administration was optimistic about coming towards some sort of agreement, perhaps in the course of the next few weeks, with a visiting trade delegation going to Washington from China. But overall, he made very clear that the US strategy ultimately was to change Chinese industrial policy. So I think in that respect, end of this trade war or not, the indication from Mike Pompeo is that those tensions overall wouldn't necessarily be coming to a quick conclusion or a quick end.
Now, of course, climate change concerns was probably the key issue that topped the WEF's list of dangers facing the global economy moving forward, especially as we're seeing worsening international relations and, of course, rising protectionism globally. These have become major obstacles to addressing the problem of climate change. So, Guy, how do you expect we'll see WEF tackle this issue this year?
This is another thing that's become more prevalent in this global risk report, this big report of global risks released by the World Economic Forum in the build-up to these meetings every year. Since the financial crisis, it's really been strictly sort of financial and economic issues which have been topping the global risk report. But this year, a number of them were things like extreme weather patterns, natural disasters, and primarily, and on the minds of many people here at the World Economic Forum, a failure of policymakers to deal with mitigating the effects of climate change and bringing down carbon emissions. And to that effect, we heard today from David Attenborough, the famous British conservationist. He was interviewed on the stage here in the main Congress Centre, and he spoke about how it was hard, in his view, to overstate the risks posed to the global economy by climate change. And he said a big part of the problem was that things like the fourth industrial revolution, this sort of move towards a more and more high-tech economy, was that it was creating a gap essentially between humans and the natural world. And so we were essentially in a state where we just do not understand the changes that are happening in the way that we should.
Well, shifting focus to the continent now, a number of African leaders will be attending. For example, Rwanda's President Kagame will be there, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, as well as South Africa's President Ramaphosa. So what is on the agenda for Africa this year?
I've spoken to a couple of African delegates here, one of them who'll be chairing one of the sessions on Africa's growth agenda in the coming year. And I think when it comes to Africa, two sort of key concerns to pick up on. One is maintaining growth, economic growth in Africa to an extent that's sustainable during a period of economic slowdown. Of course, there is traditionally that issue of investors being wary and perhaps pulling back from riskier developing markets, places like Africa during times of economic slowdown. And Africa is, as you know, a region that has already a fairly significant funding shortfall in terms of funding big investment projects. And I think there will be a big discussion here about how Africa can continue to keep that funding flow coming from other parts of the world to fund the kind of programs that it needs to continue to grow its economies. And number two, again feeding back to the main theme of this conference, Globalization 4.0, this challenge, particularly for Africa, about rapidly automating economies at a time when a number of African economies are still, yes, needed to compete in the global economy, but also, suffering from very high levels of unemployment. So how to balance those sort of two competing priorities, also a main discussion here in the Africa sessions.
Well, many thanks for that update, Guy. Of course, Guy Henderson joining us there in Davos, Switzerland. Well, let's move on now. Here's a look at our corporate headlines today. Now, Steinhoff International Holdings has disclosed claims by a former European partner firm that it owes about $331 million. Steinhoff and Seifert, a former business partner, were in a dispute over the ownership of discount furniture store chain Poco. It was notified this year that LWS planned to change a company voluntary arrangement for Steinhoff Europe. Under the arrangement, Steinhoff wants to restructure SEAG's debt by ways of a new term loan facility by the subsidiary. Meanwhile, ShopRite shares fell more than 4% before recovering following the release of a weak operational update. It showcased a flat turnover over the 6-month period ending in December 2018. The retailer's stock opened at about $13.25 per share, but weakened to trade at $13.01. Now, the group's total turnover increased by a mere 0.03% to $5.25 billion during the 6 months. Now, Kenyan flag carrier Kenyan Airways is launching new routes to Rome and Geneva starting in June. The airline is seeking to expand its base and revenue in the wake of heightened competition from other players. Now, the carrier will deploy its 787 Dreamliner 4 times a week to cover the new routes. Tickets will be available for about $699 beginning in January with an introductory price on offer until February 15th. And MasterCard has been fined about $648.3 million by the European Commission for limiting benefits offered by banks elsewhere in the European Union. However, the American multinational corporation has been granted a 10% fine reduction for cooperating with its investigation. The fine is the latest action taken by the Commission to regulate fast charge on merchants. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we're heading into a short break now, still to come. Uganda reportedly bans sports betting in the country. And South Africa reconsiders bailing Zimbabwe out of an economic crisis.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business. Only on CGTN.
Welcome back. Now, the African Union and the European Union say they've taken note of the decision by the DRC to announce Felix Tshisekedi as the new president. It's a sign that both continental bodies may be prepared to work with the new president, despite opposition in the DRC disputing the election results. Our correspondent Jack Parrick reports.
Definitely not a warm embrace for the new president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but perhaps an opening of the door for cooperation.
The African Union has taken note that the institutions of the DRC have announced the final results, and the Union remains committed to working with the people of the DRC to continue to surmount the challenges that may remain as they enter into a new political dispensation.
And it was a similar kind of expression from the EU, still not announcing its recognition of the result. Brussels says the president must be a unifying force. Felix Tshisekedi is assuming office in the DRC after the Constitutional Court ruled he'd won, despite the AU asking for the court to delay the decision. The EU and AU statements come out of the first ever joint ministerial meeting of the EU and the AU here in Brussels, where the two sides discussed peace and security missions and development cooperation. The EU is also backing the African Union's plan to set up a continental free trade area and says it's willing to immediately start negotiating a continent-to-continent agreement once that's done. The EU currently has trade deals with individual African countries or regional blocs. The European Commission announced an investment partnership in 2018 which intends to create 10 million jobs on the African continent in the next 5 years alone.
44% of Africans are now working for a job that does not generate more than $2 a day. So when we talk job creation, and we are proudly saying that the partnership has been very beneficial in terms of job creation, yes, but we need to look at the quality of these jobs. Do these jobs really generate a good income for the people in Africa?
Just as this EU-AU ministers' meeting was beginning, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa tweeted to say heads will roll potentially following an investigation into the outbreaks of violence over his fuel price hikes.
To sum up, the European position has always been this. Accountability is important, respect of the rights of citizens to fully and peacefully express themselves. Obviously, accountability doesn't mean to exercise violence in exchange.
This EU-AU ministerial is set to be made an annual event, as the continental blocs insist they're going to face their challenges together. Jack Parrick, CGTN, Brussels.
Well, let's go to Uganda now, where President Yoweri Museveni has reportedly banned the issuance of new licenses to sports betting companies and the renewal of existing ones when they expire. Now, the move is a blow to local firms like Kenya's SportsPesa that had looked to Uganda as the new frontier for growth. According to the country's finance minister, David Bahati, the reason for the ban is that it promotes joblessness amongst the youth. The ban is in contrast to its East African neighbor Kenya, which of course eased online betting taxes to about 15%. Gambling is legal in Uganda. It's regulated under the National Lotteries Act and the Gaming and Pool Betting. Well, Leon Senyange now joins us in Kampala to discuss this further. Very welcome to the show, Leon. Great to have you. Now, what we heard today from the Finance Minister, Matia Kasiaja, is that the government is not banning sports betting, but it's actually looking to lock out foreign sports betting companies from the country. So give us a sense, is it clear exactly what the government is actually doing here?
Well, the pronouncement by the Honorable Minister there, Matia Kasiaja, in itself comes as a big contradiction from what Honorable Bahati had earlier said about 20 or so hours ago, that sports betting was to be banned. Now, Kasiaja's pronouncements there, of course, coming through that only foreign-owned sports betting companies may not have their licenses renewed. That, of course, has in itself caused a storm within that business sector, with many asking who actually now owns or actually has 100% ownership of these betting companies. Now, speaking earlier to one of the board members there of the National Terrorist Board, he tells me that some of the betting companies in this country have shareholding with several Ugandans therein. Of course, whether majority or minority in itself leaves so much to question about which particular betting company is entirely or 100% foreign. So there's a lot to look into this particular proposal. It's still one that has to go through the processes of implementation, and of course, definitely this may take some time.
Well, Leon, sports betting is actually quite popular in Uganda. In fact, statistics show that over 70% of Ugandans under the age of 30 are engaged in various forms of this sport. So give us a sense of the size of the industry right now, and certainly what this move, if it is true, will mean for the sector.
Well, let me take you back to when sports betting actually started in Uganda. That was 2007, in which this particular business sector in itself grew over time. And we've since that time, 2007, seen quite an exponential growth and influence of sports betting companies. What we've been told is that there are several, or if not about 50 or more, sports betting companies that are currently operating in Uganda. Now, some of these have multiplied with their centers across the country, and like you said, about 70% of young men are involved in sports betting entirely because of one particular sport, which is football, which is the most popular sport in this country. So many place their odds there, and because of the nature of the business, football comes through as one of the easiest that many can actually bet on. But even still, the innovations that these betting companies have come out with mean that anybody, anywhere can actually bet on their phone or even on a laptop in their office, wherever they are. So in itself, this business has grown quite in leaps and bounds over the 13 or so years that it has been in existence. Now, of course, the employment that has been created therein, and in itself a source of livelihood for many of the young people. But just much more to that is that the revenue that has been collected by the government from this particular sector is quite huge. Approximately $11 billion in 2017-2018 financial year. Much more is expected in the 2018-2019 financial year, about $13 billion. Now, with some of these propositions, however, I hope it may take a slight dip going into the next phase.
Well, we certainly hope that doesn't happen. But the country's Lotteries and Gaming Regulatory Board, that's the body that supervises and regulates Uganda's gambling sector. How regulated are betting companies in the country?
Well, the government of Uganda has actually stepped up on the regulation of these betting companies. It's one of those steps where they earlier on at the beginning of this particular business didn't quite understand, and only recently have come out strong to put out some regulations, some of which include that some of the centers that these betting companies put up shouldn't be near a market, shouldn't be near a church or even a mosque, shouldn't be next to a school. Therein also the opening hours of these betting centers. And also one particular regulation is the participation of young people, those under the age of 18. This, of course, calls for closure of a betting center if found that any individuals younger than the age of 18 are taking part or involved at a particular center. So the regulation in itself has been put in place, but still the challenges exist. The limitations there still exist in implementation, enforcement, and that, of course, calls for a strengthening of capacity for the government to ensure that some of these regulations are abided by. But yes, it's still a long way in trying to regulate this particular business, given the fact that it is one that is still yet to be understood by some of the lawmakers there.
Quite interesting insight there, Leon. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, that's Leon Senyange joining us there in Kampala. Well, let's head to Zimbabwe now. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has promised to investigate a brutal crackdown by its security forces on anti-government protesters. At least a dozen people were killed. Scores others were wounded during those protests. Hundreds have been arrested since demonstrations began over a week ago. Now, the clashes erupted in Harare and Bulawayo after a decision to hike fuel prices by 150%. A lawyers group reported more rights violations since Mnangagwa's return to Harare, fueling rumors of deep divisions within his government. Well, Zimbabwe's High Court has ruled that the internet shutdown in the country is illegal. Judge Owen Tagu has requested mobile operators to immediately and unconditionally resume full services. Zimbabwe's government ordered the sporadic blackout last week Tuesday when protests against a rise in fuel prices turned violent. Here's CGTN's Tuli Shabalala with more.
Zimbabwe's government has exceeded its mandate in ordering an internet blackout.
The first relief that we sought was that the directive issued by the minister with effect from the 14th and subsequent days be suspended. We also sought a relief that the mobile internet service providers be ordered to offer unrestricted access. As you are aware, they were playing hide and seek with subscribers, sometimes offering restricted internet access where certain platforms were not accessible.
The High Court has ordered the government to restore full internet to the country.
What the court has done here is to actually grant that order and go further and actually set aside the directive that had been issued by the minister. Why the court set aside the directive was because of a finding that has been made by the court to the effect that the directive was issued by the minister, who has no power in terms of the Enabling Act to issue such a directive. The power to issue a directive in terms of the Interceptions of Communications Act was reserved to the president himself, no other person but the president.
Authorities in Zimbabwe closed the internet for much of last week. Over the weekend, it restored partial internet but kept a blackout on certain social media apps.
He has the capacity to solve. That is, if he employs all the strategies on his desk, he has all the resources, he has the people. And he must also realize that he's a manager of 15, 16 million people. So you must have the power, the authority to instruct what he thinks is the best for the people of Zimbabwe, for the country, and even for the continent and beyond.
There was no immediate comment from the internet firms or from the government lawyers on whether it would appeal the judgment. Zimbabwe has experienced turmoil for the past week over fuel price hikes. Most shops and businesses have reopened in the capital Harare, although many people are stocking up on food items in case the country faces further unrest. Tuli Shabalala, CGTN.
Now, in other news, South Africa may have had a change of heart, and that's after rejecting a $1.2 billion loan request from Zimbabwe. The country is considering extending a short-term bailout to its neighbor. South Africa's Foreign Minister Lindiwe Sisulu says the bailout discussions will be held on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now, Sisulu plans to meet Zimbabwe's Finance Minister Ntuli Nkube over these proposals. The bailout will, however, be determined by South Africa's ability to step in and rescue Zimbabwe. Moving on, 7 countries that include Egypt, Greece, Palestine, Israel, as well as Italy have formed the East Mediterranean Gas Forum. The forum is aimed at strengthening cooperation in the natural gas sector, and this comes after the latest discoveries in the East Mediterranean and forecasts for huge reserves of natural gas in this area. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim with more.
Egypt has initiated this forum after the latest gas discoveries in the Mediterranean Sea. Experts say the 7-member countries have huge gas reserves yet to be discovered in the area. And the Euromed Forum is modeled to become the natural gas equivalent of OPEC in the future.
The EM, or it's called EMGF, the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, will be the base, like similar what the condition of an institute in OPEC and OAPEC, because you know well that OPEC is responsible only to price out the oil barrel, but in the EMSGF institute will be responsible for all activities of the gas and also the cost of the 1 million BTM of the gas.
Egypt has been chosen as the headquarters. The North African country has all the facilities from pipelines, LNG plants and the highest daily production of 6.6 billion cubic feet. It has already struck deals to manufacture gas for Israel, Jordan, Cyprus and Greece.
There are challenges, however, to make this forum as huge and effective as OPEC. Some of these challenges are political.
Qatar, the largest producer of natural gas in the world, cannot be accepted in this grouping because of its political fallout with several members of the forum. There are technical challenges as well.
This is the challenge belongs to the capacities of each country from the total 7 countries in terms of production. The only one thing that's a Palestinian country not start yet to produce a gas. Also Cyprus is not start yet to produce a gas, in additional to Greece and also in Israel. But accepted Egypt, that's the only country had been started to succeed in a mega project of Zohra, which is a good contribution and optimized modeling projects that had been succeeded by the experiences of Egypt in terms of layout piping in advance to building of infrastructure for the platforms.
Cairo hopes it can help these countries lay the foundation for natural gas discoveries and make the East Mediterranean a gas hub for the rest of the world. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break now. Still to come. The U.S. government shutdown negatively affects trade of farm produce in the country. And we jazz things up with some international sounds in Havana. Do stay with us.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's recap today's headlines. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the European Union as well as the African Union now say they've taken note of the decision by the country's constitutional court to validate Felix Tshisekedi's disputed election victory. They add that they are willing to work with his administration. Tshisekedi is due to become the first Congolese head of state to take power through an election since independence leader Patrice Lumumba in 1960. And the United Nations and agencies have criticized European countries for not allowing migrants to disembark at safe ports. More than 140 people who were rescued at sea have been taken to a detention center in Misrata in Libya. The UNHCR spokesman insists that the rescue at sea has been taken hostage by politics. In Burkina Faso, President Roch Marc Christian Kabore has appointed economist Christophe Joseph Marie Dabir as the new prime minister. Now, this comes 72 hours after the resignation of Paul Kaba-Tieba and his entire cabinet. So far, no reason has been given for the former prime minister's resignation. And that's a look at our headlines today. Now, Chicago has the world's largest market for farm products futures. The shutdown of the U.S. government not only affected the lives of government employees, it has also disrupted the operation of the commodity exchange. Take a look.
The U.S. is one of the biggest grain producing and exporting countries. The Chicago Board of Trade is the largest market for farm produce trading in the world. The trade volume here affects the pricing of grains around the world. Every day, staff here gathers online data provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and after analysis, a report about the pricing and the quantity of grains will be issued to buyers and sellers. But during the month of the government shutdown, no data gets updated.
Without having federal data from the USDA, it makes it really difficult to see where we are and how we can gauge the carryout, because normally we're watching shipments and where they're going, and all of that data is completely in the dark. So we're literally flying with blindfolders on.
McGarthy says they are now getting information by asking around, speaking with institutions, or even guessing.
Everyone is looking to alternative news sources to find ways to find out what the supplies are, what the U.S. supplies are, and what the world estimates are. And so we're using different countries that are not, their governments are not shut down, like Brazil and Argentina, and really a number of countries in South America, maybe even smaller ones that still have production.
McGarthy says the level of difficulty for information gathering makes her feel like she has been transported back in time for about 60 years, and without federal data, it is very difficult for farmers to gauge how much commodities they should sell or store. She says everyone now is in a wait-and-see mode, hoping to ride out this rough patch. Song Yao-Tian, CGTN.
Now, as leaders continue to arrive at the World Economic Forum in Davos, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he's optimistic about the upcoming U.S.-China trade talks. He made that statement while addressing the forum in Davos via satellite link.
There are those who say that superpower conflict between our two countries is inevitable. We don't see it that way. We want to find places where we can work together. You talked about the trade delegation coming. I'm optimistic that we'll receive them well and that we'll have a good outcome from those conversations. But remember, the course of the relationship will be determined by the principles that America stands by. Free and open seas, the capacity for nations to take their goods around the world. Fair and reciprocal trade arrangements where every country has the opportunity to compete on a fair, transparent, and open basis.
Meanwhile, debate over China's economic situation is at fever pitch as the nation releases its 2018 GDP growth figures. Now, some are saying the economy's current state and forecasts aren't as rosy as the experts are promising. Yet China's top economic planner, the National Development and Reform Commission, says not to worry as they detail the nation's macroeconomic performance. Here's CGTN's Wang Mengzhen with more.
With China's GDP growth rate hitting a 28-year low, some fear it's even worse than the 6.6% figure announced by the authorities. A spokesperson for China's macroeconomic planning body refuted that suggestion, providing other figures.
Per capita disposable income reached nearly 30,000 yuan, or about $4,200. That's an increase of 6.5% after deducting pricing factors. Also, look at electricity consumption, an 8.5% increase, the highest since 2012. And natural gas, up 17%. These numbers match our official GDP growth rate well.
As Meng reiterates, it's quality rather than speed of the growth that China is pursuing. To achieve this, the NDRC has stressed the role of economic restructuring, particularly in supply-side reforms, to tackle issues like overcapacity. Recently, some media reports hinted at mass layoffs among Chinese internet companies. Meng also responded to that.
Recruitment and employment are generally stable within Chinese internet companies, based on a variety of research and investigation we have conducted. And in 2018, the nation still created 13.6 million urban jobs, while supply in the job market is still larger than the demand.
But facing downward economic pressure, Meng says challenges remain. This summer, the number of new college graduates is expected to reach a record high of over 8.3 million.
Among all measures to stabilize our job market, one highlight is to encourage more people, especially college graduates, to start their own businesses. By doing so, we will have more supportive policies, including further tax cuts, funding, and skills training.
Meng says China will open its door wider to foreign investment and business, especially in supporting more foreign-funded projects to better establish themselves in China. Wang Mengjun, CGTN, Beijing.
Now, as factories become more automated, the need for manpower continues to decline. Or does it? Well, one of China's largest appliance makers is rapidly expanding in the most advanced ways, and it now says they need human help to do so. It's all part of the World Economic Forum's plans to make smart manufacturing a key component of the fourth industrial revolution. CGTN's Shu Xin-Chan reports from Qingdao.
Robotic arms are no longer a luxury, but some companies still lack the software to fully enable these steel muscles. Chinese electrical appliance maker Haier is pulling out all the stops.
This is the station where we expand pipes. We're not only using robotic arms, but also a sensor to read the product's information so that the machine can change programs on its own. It used to take 2 hours by manual labor, but now only 45 minutes.
The World Economic Forum, in collaboration with the management consulting firm McKinsey & Company, selected Haier's factory in Qingdao as one of the 16 smart factories globally to help the rest navigate the sea of digitalization, finding ways to use internet-based technology to power up. The Chinese factory made its name by offering highly customizable products, a new service not achievable with only human labor.
This Haier factory has a mind all its own, but according to the World Economic Forum and McKinsey's latest findings, automation does not necessarily mean job loss, at least not for now.
Digitalization allows the capacity to expand 3 times with only 1/3 of the workforce, but it also brings the need to speed up that expansion, which means more jobs.
In fact, our factory has been hiring more. Smart manufacturing enhances workers' capabilities and allows us to offer more attractive products and better user experience. Thus, we expand faster now.
The factory now produces over 1,000 units of highly customized commercial air conditioners a year to meet increased market demand. Cosmoplat is what enables the factory to think on its own. It brings together big data, cloud computing, and the Internet of Things. Cosmoplat can link the appliance maker's ecosystem all together, finding available parts requested by customers and putting them into production. And engineers believe Customization is what the fourth industrial revolution truly is about.
How to improve efficiency is very important, and high efficiency only matters if high precision is achieved. What is high precision? It means getting customers involved in the production. We have to know who they are and what their needs are to satisfy their demands.
While amidst that, China's huge online population is a catalyst for Cosmoplat to become a reality. Vast data generated among Chinese people. And now, the company is also starting to integrate the system into overseas markets. As stated in the World Economic Forum and McKinsey's research, model factories like Haier are beginning a unique learning journey, and they are demonstrators of digital manufacturing and the next phase of globalization, what the forum calls Globalization 4.0. Xu Xingchen, CGTN, Qingdao, Shandong Province.
Well, let's move on now to the Cuban capital of Havana, where music lovers have gathered for the 34th International Jazz Festival. The festival is most well known for its music events featuring international and the island's hottest jazz musicians. Well, CGTN's Luis Chirino was there and filed this report.
Havana nights lit up during a week of jazz performances by some of the world's best musicians, with both local and foreign artists taking to the city stages. Renowned Cuban jazz band leader Orlando Valle, better known as Maraca, was a festival highlight, as were appearances by the Grammy Award-winning American trumpet player Brian Lynch and Puerto Rican flautist Nestor Torres. During rehearsals, Maraca talked with me about this standout performance.
It's an homage to Roy Hargrove and Dave Valentine, two giants of Latin jazz who once played at this festival and have already passed away.
The central core of the sensibility of jazz comes from the African music sensibility. So this is something that Cuba and the United States really shares.
The concerts were held at Havana's main downtown theaters and drew huge crowds from near and far. Jazz has always built bridges between the American and the Cuban people, and this festival is a clear example of that reality. Many American fans timed trips to Havana just so they could attend the festival.
Music is another form of communications, right? And so it's a beautiful way for us to communicate with the Cubans and vice versa.
Cubans and Americans enjoyed the jazz stage together when the creator of the festival, Maestro Bobby Carcassez, was joined by U.S. jazz musicians Scotty Barnard, Roger Glenn, and Dick Griffin. Another memorable performance came from British soul singer Jo Stone, who brought a special touch to the Jazz Fest with her mezzo-soprano voice. An emotional moment came during an improvised duet between Jo Stone and Cuban singer Omara Portuondo. Their Spanish language collaboration and embodiment of a festival theme, bringing Cuban and world musicians together. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
Well, let's shift focus now and take a look at how commodities performed today. Gold prices bounced back from multi-week lows as mounting concerns of an economic slowdown exacerbated by a cut in the IMF's global growth forecast suddenly drove investors to the safety of the precious metal. Meanwhile, oil prices falling almost 2% today on signs that the economic slowdown in China is spreading, suddenly stoking concerns about global growth and, of course, fuel demand globally. Let's take a short break now. Still to come. An Egyptian factory offers an alternative to boost dwindling cotton production in the country. And a regulatory framework is in the pipeline to try and stabilize cryptocurrencies.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, back in 2016, agricultural production of Egypt's high-quality long staple cotton hit a more than 100-year low. Production has slumped since 2011 at a time of political upheaval that coincided with looser regulations that degraded the quality of local cotton. Now, an Egyptian factory, however, is recycling plastic bottles, turning them into fiber as an alternative to cotton. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangari with the story.
Cotton, which is Egypt's most famous export, has become scarce after its production fell over the years. As a result, the country turned to recycling. The Pharaoh's polyester staple fiber factory is among the few emerging recycling factories that reuse plastic bottles to make fiber. The fiber is then used to make polyester fabric.
The use of cotton has decreased by a big percentage. Firstly, because in Egypt less cotton is being planted, and it is starting to decrease globally too. The manufacturers call this fiber the alternative to cotton. They use it instead of cotton. They use it for a lot of things as an alternative for cotton.
Recent government efforts are helping boost production, but manufacturers say purchasing cotton remains expensive. This is where polyester fiber is filling a gap. Recycling factory owners believe that the cheaper fabric can fill the supply gap caused by the decline in Egypt's historic cotton industry.
We have a skillful workforce. We don't have any foreign workers, just like most factories in Egypt. There is plenty of raw material, but we need state support when it comes to the raw material, especially by reducing imports. The state should legalize the status of factories manufacturing raw materials because not all of them are registered. Many of them work unofficially. We want them to work legally. So when I deal with them, I have my receipts. This I will give back to the state and it will benefit the state in taxes and revenues. I will also benefit as a citizen, not just as a manufacturer.
The factory started production last year, with production reaching 1,800 tons of fiber monthly. Its main clients are textile companies that sell cheaper clothing partially made from polyester. Managers at the recycling plant, however, say they need state support, especially through limits on imports that can compete with the recycled fiber.
People need to understand the value of this bottle. You can make wearable clothing from this bottle, even if you cannot recycle that. You can make suits from this bottle, you can make shirts and even pants. That is because it has a percentage of polyester. This carries the same genes as natural cotton. However, instead of throwing it away, we use it. As a cheaper price, you can buy a pair of pants with a certain percentage of polyester, but you don't know if it was recycled or not. All of these things also require certificates of quality. No one takes up this business without being certified. These things have to be safe for people to wear them, and the proof is that you initially drink from it.
At a time when climate change effects are spreading rapidly, with proper support from the government, this new alternative can provide a stable livelihood for Egyptians, as well as protect the environment and promote economic growth. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Now, cryptocurrencies have been quite volatile in the past 6 months. In fact, we've seen Bitcoin pretty much hammered since hitting astronomical heights, recording a plunge of about 70% since 2017. However, CGTN's Angelo Coppola tells us now background developers and regulators have been hard at work building a regulatory framework to create stability within its blockchain. Take a look.
Cryptocurrencies are in their infancy when one considers that it took decades for the world's currencies to work together to create a global financial system.
That cryptocurrency must really solve a unique use case, and it must solve a problem for a large number of people across the world to really become the de facto cryptocurrency. Also, we're seeing new technology and new altcoins or new cryptocurrencies, which really is a new technology, and it's not designed to replace Bitcoin as such. And I believe for that reason, it's likely and possible that some of these cryptocurrencies will coexist in the future.
Despite the perception of fluidity in crypto development, players in the space need stability.
We need, if we want to look at a blockchain or cryptocurrency world, is that we need our protocols to be stable. This means that companies can depend on them, and if they start building their applications on top of these protocols, they have that assurance that there's not going to be changes into the future that are going to impact upon the work that they've been doing. What is missing, though, are very easy applications like wallets and so on, and I think what we're going to start seeing is the development of easy-to-use applications, wallets, and also use cases in other industries like supply chains.
It's all about scalability. Currently, the Bitcoin blockchain can only process between 7 and 10 transactions per second.
What is unknown is the work going on behind the scenes to scale the Bitcoin network to arguably process millions of transactions per second. And one example of that is the Lightning Network. And I think the next year or two we'll see more companies rolling out, more blockchain companies rolling out the Lightning Network to process millions of transactions per second.
Others take a different view of what the sector will look like in the near future.
So what we're going to see is a few number of these protocols establishing themselves as stable, secure protocols that can scale, and many of the other protocols that exist out there will probably fall away.
Cryptocurrencies and assets are borderless and global, and this has challenged many jurisdictions when it comes to developing regulations. Some say for it to reach its full potential, the new currencies need millions, if not billions of users. It's early days yet, but the potential is there. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, before we go, let's check in on Africa's currencies today. South Africa's rand weaker against major global currencies, of course performing worst amongst its emerging market peers. And that's amid a risk-off tone in global markets today. Of course, the dollar was also firmer due to investor interest in safe haven assets right now. Meanwhile, Kenya's shilling was firm against the dollar. It was supported by tightening liquidity in the money markets, as well as diaspora remittances amidst a thin oil importer demand in the country. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and of course the rest of the team, thanks for watching.